Hi, everybody. I'm Bobby Stevens, and welcome back to That Makes Sense. This is, of course, the podcast where we break down consumer trends to explore their impact on businesses and on all of us. Today's episode is all about cybersecurity. You know, we find ourselves living in a cyber everywhere world where digital transformation continues to accelerate. It's pretty exciting, but it also increases risks. What are the biggest challenges for an organization in managing cybersecurity? What steps are taken to navigate this increase in cybersecurity incidents? We'll take a look at that and more in this episode with the help of Elias Oxendine, the Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO, at Yum Brands, and Vikram Rao, a Managing Director with me here at Deloitte, who focuses on cyber and strategic risk services. Thank you both for joining me here today.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to be here, Bobby.
Cool. So to ground ourselves, I want to quickly start with some data that everybody can understand. Specifically, the key findings from Deloitte's Future of Cyber survey, where 41% of CIOs and CISOs we surveyed acknowledged that gaining visibility across the increasingly complex ecosystem is really the greatest challenge they face. That phrase in itself was a mouthful, so we'll break that down into digestible pieces in this episode. So Vikram, maybe we start with you. Can you tell us what were the key themes from the report in the study? And then Elias, would love to get your take on those themes.
Sure, Bobby. It's a fascinating survey. We interviewed over 500 C-suite executives around the globe who are responsible for cybersecurity. And the survey really shines light on what are we really up against as cybersecurity professionals. So 3 important themes I'll touch on: emerging technologies, the COVID pandemic, and people. So we hear in the headlines about new cutting-edge technologies like quantum computing, 5G, AI, and we don't fully understand the cybersecurity implications and risks they pose, and even existing technologies like cloud are rapidly evolving. And this creates a weird mashup of old technologies talking to new technologies with no traditional enterprise boundaries, and all of this makes it very complex to gain cyber visibility. The COVID pandemic, that's the next theme we saw. We all know the COVID pandemic has accelerated the digital transformation efforts, and companies that didn't accelerate probably lost market share. So it needed to be done to survive. But this speed gives you less time to contemplate cyber risks. The technologies and processes that were cobbled together in the time of this crisis were supposed to be temporary solutions. But often, as we all know, it becomes a permanent solution. And it's like anything where, once a product and a service hits the market and cash is flowing in, nobody wants to revisit it or touch it and redesign security. It's quite disruptive at that stage. And lastly, people. I mean, the entire corporate workforce has become remote. They want the ability to work from anywhere on any device. Customers are becoming more demanding with how companies treat their data. Regulators are doubling down on laws and regulations about data privacy. And lastly, hackers. I mean, they're getting more sophisticated by the day. And with these new emerging technologies, it has opened up a lot of new avenues for hackers to attack in this cyber battlefield.
One thing that stuck out was still just the market and business kind of driving things first, and then a lot of other parts of a company having to react. Elias, you've been focused on the IT space for much of your career, and specifically security. How have these focus areas for you kind of evolved compared to maybe what you were thinking about, say, 5 years ago? Would love to hear your expertise on this.
Yeah, sure, Bobby. Vikram was so spot on with the things that he was speaking to. I'm sitting here nodding my head, very strongly at all those points. And so certainly from the emerging technologies, as we look at things like AI, machine learning, et cetera, all these are great transformative innovations out there that propel the business forward. All those things are positive. And then what we do from a cyber perspective is make sure we secure those the best we can. But the challenge, as Vikram was alluding to, is just the mesh of the new and the old technology. But with all that innovation that comes from these emerging technologies, the hackers are also taking advantage of these exact same things, right? So the use of AI and machine learning for us are great defenses, but the hackers are using them to their advantage as well to defeat those defenses. In terms of the pandemic, absolutely, Yum is not immune to this. Certainly with COVID hit, we were racing to get, into the digital technology space more so than we have. And so we brought on new teams, new resources with an emphasis on technology. to make us propel us forward, right? So we brought on companies like a Quantum, TikTok, all these things that help us reach our consumers so that they can easily purchase our products. In terms of people, absolutely. 5 years ago, would you ask me, have we be in the middle of a pandemic like this, right? Where everyone is remote and working anywhere from any device, anytime. And I'm thinking there's no way, it's a slim chance. Maybe 10 years, not 5 years. But with the pandemic, it certainly has accelerated that. But also to Vikram's point, the consumer is more focused on privacy now, right? And their data. And what we've seen there is that change from not only is their data safe with us, but can they trust us with the data? Because without that trust, there is no relationship. Therefore, there is no sale that takes place.
It's really interesting. You mentioned, at Yum, what you guys had to do during the pandemic as people were still hungry. So how are we getting into more delivery and third-party apps and other ways to sort of make it as convenient and safe as possible? That then of course opens up additional routes of collecting consumer data, and then the privacy aspect comes out. And I think probably across every industry, companies were prioritizing digital over the last few years to remain competitive and get new products and service to market. And there was a really big emphasis on speed there. That speed, though, kind of exposes organizations to new forms of risk. You guys have alluded to them a little bit when it comes to cyber. Vikram, maybe for our audience, can you paint kind of a high-level picture of what some of these popular digital transformations are? What are companies really focused on and kind of changing these days? And really further, how are they assessing the underlying cyber risks that come with these new things?
Yeah, sure, Bobby. There are some really bold transformations ahead. Let me give the audience a little bit of statistics on what are some of the top transformations. So the number one was data analytics. That was the very first one, followed by movement to the cloud and ERP upgrades. Those were the top kind of three priorities. The next one on the list was interesting, and we haven't seen this in the past. The next one on the list was digitizing and modernizing factories, warehouses, manufacturing facilities, which traditionally have had like really old, archaic kind of technologies. So that was kind of fourth on the list. And then, AI, cognitive computing, IoT and connected devices, and then lastly, blockchain and crypto. So those were some of the digital transformations that companies are embarking on. And to your question about assessing and mitigating cyber risk, I mean, that requires a bit of a cultural shift. I would say, open lines of communication and seat at the table with the business leaders who are running these transformations. I think that's really important. Secondly, I would say, integrated teams who can proactively assess cyber risk as the transformation is being designed. I think that's important, not after the fact. And lastly, you need, budget and leadership support and a mindset that cybersecurity is really an enabler. It's a differentiator for your business and not an impediment. Elias, I bet you deal with company culture on a daily basis. So love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, tell me about it in the places I've been, and certainly in Yum as well, right? And so certainly, yes, big cultural shifts are taking place here. I think first and foremost with the digital transformation, with this transition, is that our business partners are starting to learn that in order for them to really be successful on this journey, is that they must involve cybersecurity earlier on in the process, right? And we're talking about things like code development and infrastructure. And if you think about it in the past, usually security is the roadblock. Security gets seen at the very end of any type of a project and these kind of things, right? Well, with speed to market, you can't do that. So certainly they're bringing us forward early into the process, with a shift left or dev security operations, to where we're involved up front to make sure that we're not rolling any type of vulnerabilities, anything that can lead to a security incident once that particular product or solution goes to market. Certainly, second thing, transition to the cloud, right? So a lot of businesses are making that transition to minimize their physical footprint in the data center and then moving into the cloud. When people go to the cloud, a lot of times there's this mindset of, well, we'll put it in the cloud, we'll set it, and we'll forget it, right? It's just lift and shift. But at the same time, they need to understand no, you're not done yet. We need to look at proper security configurations for those cloud instance environments, but also get tooling in place that makes sure that there is security compliance is being satisfied and met to make sure everything is secure and protected in that space. But then Vikram, as you mentioned as well too, We as cybersecurity, we want to be a good partner to the business. Therefore, we're working constantly to make sure that we are brought in early on projects and not at the end. Because when you look at the number of breaches and incidents that are taking place today, we're all trying to be successful as a business, and we need the consumer to do that. If the consumer does not have trust in what we're doing with the data and it's secure, then we're not able to be successful from a business perspective.
You guys hit on a lot there, and some pretty big.
Sorry.
No, in a good way, and some pretty big things. So things like moving your entire ERP and financial systems, changing the way your teams work together, and when they get involved with big projects, engendering an important concept like trust that's kind of esoteric and actually making it kind of real within both an organization and to your end consumers and your customers. And so I do want to just kind of extend on that consumer piece a little bit. As consumers, we really do expect personalized, targeted experiences, convenience. We kind of want everything from our food delivery, Yum Brands, there you go, to travel, to healthcare, to be frictionless, kind of based on our needs. But what we don't want is, the sense of being followed or watched everywhere by marketers who want to feed us kind of an endless diet of offers, solicitations, whatever. So Vikram, start with you. How are companies managing customer data differently? How are they connecting online and in-person experiences while also protecting privacy? And what's that natural tension look like?
Sure. Yeah. I'll say companies have come a long way in managing the customer data better. And if I look at the survey we did, over 90% of the chief marketing officers stated that they feel their organizations did a pretty good job balancing the data with customer trust. Now, that paints a rosy picture, and I personally feel the truth is somewhere in the middle. But more progress needs to be made, but they've definitely come a long way. But the regulatory environment is definitely forcing companies to get better organized with data. But the regulations are, they have their own limitations. It's a privacy regulations are a patchwork of state, federal, global laws. Sometimes the requirements are conflicting, so it's a bit of a challenge to comply. But I think companies need to really think about, if they really want to get customer trust, shouldn't they be really going above and beyond the basic compliance? I mean, the new generation of customers, they're passionate about many things like, climate change, social economic issues. They're certainly a lot more passionate than I was when I was young. So this new generation is not going to hesitate to boycott a brand if they don't think they're, good stewards of their data. So, this whole concept of data privacy by design, that's really important. And a lot of it is around educating your employees, thinking about, do I really need this information from my customer? And if I do really need it, then I shouldn't be replicating this data all over the place in the enterprise, and I got to put the right safeguards. And lastly, be transparent with your customers about privacy.
Yeah, and I would say, what do you mean when you were young, man? You and I are still young. What are you talking about?
You stole my joke.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was going to say, but we're still young. We're still in the game. And so certainly from my perspective, what I've seen, once again, Vikram is spot on. For us here at Yum, and I expect other global companies do this as well too, but certainly what we do here from a Yum perspective is that you've got these local, regional regulations that come up all the time. And what we've done is we have structured our data privacy team by regions, in which that particular team is responsible for what comes out of that region, making sure they know all the ins and outs, all the details, and then they drive our compliance, to that. And so that's been something we've had in place now for like the last, 12, 18 months. Is working very well for us. But these new privacy regulations, they come out all the time. And so we really make sure we're in front of that as best as possible. Still doing some work to do there. The other piece is, once again, it's that consumer engagement and trust, right? So I don't want to sound like a broken record here repeating myself, but trust is so important. Trust is almost like a new currency today, and that we must make sure that we continue to build that trust and we maintain that with the consumer. And so a lot of ways companies can go about with this trust is, there are requirements out there like data subject requests, where the consumer can ask, well, what information do you have on me and how are you using it? But I think to Vikram's point, to even take it a step further, we, in our side, we're offering up consent and preference management. So this is really giving that consumer, so Bobby, the thing you were talking about, hey, how do you contact me? How do you engage with me? we're setting up in a tool that we have in our environment, our space, that we capture their consent, and then we also capture their preference on how they want us to engage with them. So once again, trying to build that level of trust and go a little further with it downfield.
I love that. I mean, you kind of hit on two things that were a bit internal facing. The one is how you've organized your teams within regions, just so you can be, ear to the ground, so to speak, in those regions. And then the consumer preference center, important. With that said, obviously cybersecurity investments are a prime focus of investment for you, given your role and broader organizations today. Kind of to both of you, but maybe let's start with you, Elias. What are some of the more important methods and tools that you're deploying, in addition to what you just mentioned, to guide your cybersecurity investments and to track potentially the return on those investments?
Yeah, absolutely. So the focus for me is it is strategic and then it's tactical / operational. From a strategic standpoint, most companies, and I've done this in my past everywhere that I've been, is that we conduct these periodic security program maturity assessments, right? So this is where you bring in, and you can either do this yourself or you can bring in a third party to do this for you, but they essentially come in and they assess the program on a capability maturity scale. That's a scale of going 1 to 5. 1 being very initial. 5 means you figured it out. Congratulations. Go write a book, go sell it, make some money, right? On what you're doing with your program. And so, but we would typically take this maturity assessment and we use pretty much the NIST framework. And I would share with you is that once you take this assessment and you present it up to your board of directors or audit committee, this is something they're familiar with and they know. And once they see this, they know what it is, they get excited, they get locked in. And so certainly the program maturity assessment is one way you can do that. From a tactical operational standpoint, we look at cybersecurity risk metrics, kind of KPIs or KRIs in this perspective. And the thought process is with any type of investment to address and fix a KPI is that risk, that metric itself will improve and get better. But that's how we know if it does get better, then we know that investment is paying off dividends.
Mm-hmm. What Elias just said aligns well with what we've seen in the survey. More than 40% of the respondents said they use maturity assessments, cybersecurity assessments to guide their investment decisions. The next was, 35% said they use risk quantification tools, which includes some of the things that, Elias just touched on, like KPIs and KRIs, and what are your cybersecurity metrics, and, which metrics are the most important. But I will say this ROI question in the cyber field is not an easy one. I mean, it's much harder to translate cyber risk into dollars and cents, but there are some interesting tools in the market we're seeing for risk quantification space and just metrics and using some real data to convert that into kind of dollars and looking at certain scenarios for risk. So we're seeing some movement in the market there.
So with that, what do you find to be the most challenging aspect of the job if maybe getting the funding for it isn't the hardest thing right now? What is the hardest part of the job, or what is the most challenging aspect of the job?
Yeah, well, I'll jump in here, right? I think, and certainly 3 things, you see I bucket things in 3s. The first 2 we've already kind of spoke to, right? So that digital transformation, just really keeping current, keeping pace, to support the business on that journey. Culture, spoken to this one as well also, to where we really got to shift to where people see security as, we're the friendly security guys, right? We're not, bad parts of the business, right? So that's another thing for us. But what's really hitting, and we haven't touched on this, and just briefly, is finding and retaining that cybersecurity talent. The market is, particularly for cybersecurity professionals, are hot right now. And whereas typically in the past, I would try to find local talent, but since COVID has hit, everything's remote. So I'm not just competing locally now, I'm competing, on a national level and sometimes on a global level, trying to find, talent. But then once I have it, I got to work to make sure I retain it as well.
Yeah, our survey was very similar. Digital transformations, hybrid IT, dealing with all of that were some of the biggest challenges. Talent was definitely on the top list for executives from a challenge standpoint. In the culture, I mean, this definitely makes it even worse if the culture is rigid and not adapting to the current times. And cyber hygiene, that was also one other thing we saw, is in large organizations with a lot going on, and a lot of the breaches we see are not because of sophisticated attacks, but because of just basic cyber hygiene issues. So that's definitely another challenging area And to your question, Bobby, you talked about the funding. The funding is definitely become much easier over time. But I think what is becoming difficult is explaining to the CFOs and other executives, how is that? To my earlier point about how do you take that funding and how do you show the progress that this funding has reduced the overall risk, and how does that translate to return? I think that's definitely a little bit of a subjective discussion.
Yeah, the risk and the scary factor only probably lasts for so long, and in certain areas we've got to show a measurable return also, which I think is fair, but that's good to know. And it's really interesting to hear you guys kind of come at it from both the Elias, the hands-on experience perspective, and then Vikram, the broader view of the market and the survey and the data. It's a really, really nice back and forth. So why don't we do a final question here? And for those who've listened before know that my final questions are either fun or a little open-ended. And this one, we'll keep it open-ended. Not that cybersecurity isn't fun, so I don't want to give that impression whatsoever. But
thank you.
Yeah, let's look forward-looking. So the cybersecurity landscape, we've just talked about it. I mean, even in the last year, right? It's been very dynamic. So how do you see it evolving over the next 5 years? Like what's one or two things that our listeners could take away as almost a prediction from you? We won't hold you to it, but love to hear each of you. Maybe Vikram, you go first, and Elias, you follow up.
Sure, yeah. So to look at how the cyber landscape is changing, you have to really look at how the technology landscape is changing. So, some of the technology trends we are seeing are data sharing is becoming easier. I mean, COVID has made some of that easier because of shared data was used for medical advancements, things like that. So that trend we're seeing, significant innovations in IT automations and cloud vendors is next. Blockchain is going to be ready for business, and then an explosion of internet connected devices. So those are the technology trends. So cyber is going to go hand in hand with all of those technology trends. And we'll have to assess the cyber risk as we go and adapt and go from there. I do think we're going to see more use of AI in cyber, both on the defensive side and unfortunately on the offensive side as well, meaning the bad guys. And then hopefully we'll see more cyber board governance, elevation of the CISO's role, etc. That's my take. Elias?
Yeah, I will add, I think certainly the technology view is the right perspective to look at it. And, Vikram, as you mentioned, we're going to see more of that, more AI, more machine learning, right? Today, there's still a human in the loop to a certain extent. And eventually, I think the technology will get to where it's tech versus tech. So eventually, I think the human will be out of the loop. Certainly elevation of the CISO into board positions, right? We've already seen some of that coming out from the SEC announcement, I think last week, about similar to SOX. They want to see the same thing happen from a cyber perspective. And then Bobby, since you put it out there, being a little froggy, I guess with the metaverse, right? That's what's happening, what's going on now. We're still kind of waiting to see with this one, right? And I think given the use of the cryptocurrency and NFTs, and as businesses actually, well, some are already doing this, purchasing space in the metaverse to actually conduct business to where someone can go in with an avatar, order, and then have it physically show up at your house, right? So still waiting to see how this plays out. I think there might be some new cyber attacks that are different than what we've seen in conventional ways, but watching that one closely and see what happens and what develops there. So stay tuned, I guess.
You left us on a perfect note. That is exactly the sort of question that I love to leave the listeners with. And lots to look forward to in the space, even if there's quite a few things we should also be looking out for, which I think is an interesting kind of thing that when you're looking at cybersecurity, when you're the advancement of technology and how to keep that safe and secure, you kind of always striking that balance. So with that, I really want to thank you both for your time. I want to thank you for coming on the show and really breaking down what is a pretty complex topic, frankly, for our listeners, but it's something that impacts them every probably second, or at least every minute, even if they don't realize it. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me, Bobby. This was fun.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks. So for the listeners who are interested in learning a bit more about the report that Vikram discussed today, you can search for Deloitte 2021 Future of Cyber Survey. Also, you can connect with Elias, Vikram, or myself on LinkedIn for more. Thank you guys for listening, and catch you next time on That Makes Sense. You can listen on your favorite podcatcher, whether it be Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Spotify. Simply search for That Makes Sense. Connect with me on social media, Bobby Stevens on LinkedIn or @Bobby Stevens on Twitter. This presentation contains general information only, and Deloitte is not, by means of this presentation, rendering accounting, business, financial, investment, legal, tax, or other professional advice or services. This presentation is not a substitute for such professional advice or services, nor should it be used as a basis for any decision or action that may affect your business. Before making any decision or taking any action that may affect your business, you should consult a qualified professional advisor. Deloitte shall not be responsible for any loss sustained by any person who relies on this presentation.